Well, it is good to be back with you for another day as we are continuing on through the Advent Jesse tree. Now, if you're not aware what a Jesse tree is essentially a 25-day journey through 25 sections of mostly the Hebrew scriptures and then a little bit in the New Testament, making a journey essentially from creation all the way to Jesus, talking about the character of God and also many members of Jesus' family tree, hence the name Jesse Tree. You can find out more about it by going to go.christtable.today/Jesse Tree. And if you'd like to find out more about Christ Table, how you can be a part, and even how you can support, we'd love for you to visit that URL right there, www.christtable.today. And if you would choose to be a part of this, you can sign up for our email list there, and you can also donate, and we're glad to have you a part. And also, I love doing these live in the mornings. I love seeing you together. In fact, I hear a little ding on my screen every time somebody comments, and so it's always fun for people to check in, even ask questions live, which if I have time or see them, then I try to get to them. And then even afterwards, it's always nice to go back and as people watch them on delay, hear the feedback in the comments and as well. So thanks for being along with us for this journey. Today, we find ourselves in Genesis chapter 12 and in the first 7 verses. And this is actually one of my favorite sections of the Hebrew scriptures because it's a really compelling story that is easily understood and easily applicable to our lives. And so it is the essentially launch of the story of Abram, who will become Abraham, who is a very prominent figure, not just in the Old Testament, but also is a very prominent figure as well because of the promise made to him. It's a very prominent figure for Gentiles and for us who are not of the Jewish faith either. So today's ornament, and like I said, there are 25 symbols or images, and today's ornament I actually was the first one that I dug out, which I think might be a minor miracle that I actually pulled it out rather than having to go through each and every one of them. But today's image, today's ornament is the tent. Abram was a Bedouin. He was a person who essentially lived in the desert and oftentimes was as a Bedouin in transit to other places, never really staying in one place. But Abram stayed essentially in one area in Ur, which was the city of his father, and did very well for himself, became a very prominent individual and a very wealthy individual in livestock by staying there and living at that time in one place. But God is going to ask Abram to do something that is exceedingly radical, both in what God asks Abram to do, and God seems to always kind of be asking Abram to do radical things, and this is the first one. But not just what he asks him to do, but the foundations of information that he gives Abram are very small. And so the context is also pretty radical as well. So I may be getting ahead of myself. So let's just go ahead and jump into verse 1 of chapter 12 of Genesis. And we will get to all of the verses today because it's a relatively short reading. So Lord had said to Abram, leave. Now, that word, actually, there's a lot behind that word. I don't know where you were born and where you grew up, but I was born in a place in the Midwest, a small town where people did not move away. You know, that classic John Cougar Mellencamp song, I was born in a small town, grew up in that same small town, I'll die in that small town, describes the context in which I grew up and many of us grew up as well. But I moved away. I was very unique, an outsider, and abnormal in doing that. Most of my friends in high school still live there, which makes it a little fun because whenever I go home, it's a bit like a reunion. My family's there, my friends are there. I don't have to travel all around the country to see everyone. They're all still in one place. So I rather like it. And I am certain that Abram also rather liked everybody being in one place. The place he'd grown up, the place where he expected that he would die, surrounded by his family, just like his father, when his father would die, would have expected to be surrounded by Abram and his son and Abram's family because they all lived there. And God one day just says to Abram, leave. I know this isn't what people do in your community. This isn't what people do in your family. I know that you have a responsibility to all of your livestock and all of your things. You're not going to be able to take it with you. There's no U-Haul. There's no 2 men in a truck. You're not going to probably be able to take it all with you. You may not even be there to see your father and your family age and pass. Leave. Leave behind everything you've ever known. Be the odd one out. Leave. Leave your native country. Leave your relatives. Leave your father's family. Now, for some of us, we're thinking, maybe leaving isn't so bad. Relatives. Maybe what God has in mind, maybe the worst thing that God could have planned is better than staying with relatives. If that's you, well, may God bless you during the holidays. But leave your relatives, your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. God doesn't even tell him where he's going. He just says, pack everything up, leave behind everything you've ever known, and go. And at some point, I'll tell you the rest. Would you go? I mean, choosing to believe that you had heard from God and not from the Mexican food that you had eaten the night before is one thing. But choosing to believe that you had heard from God, who was being seemingly coy with the information that is necessary for you to actually execute this plan, is quite another level of, well, faith or stupidity. And Abram isn't going to find out which it is until he's already past the point of making a fool of himself or a hero of himself. Think about that. Abram has to risk his wealth, his reputation, his standing, and his ability to ever be thought of as being a person of integrity or wisdom again. He has to essentially risk all of that in order to follow God, in order to be obedient. Why did God do that? God didn't have to do that. I don't know. Is God unnecessarily cruel in that he toys with us in that way? I don't want to think that. Is it a possibility? Let's be honest, between you and me, yeah, it is a possibility. We have to be open to that possibility, I suppose. I rather like to think, especially upon knowing the rest of the story, I rather like to think that this was a necessary character quandary for Abram. That there was something unique, or maybe uniquely wrong, or that needed refining in Abram's character, and that Abram needed, in order to receive the blessing and all of the information, he needed to have the choice between courage and risk and looking like a fool. I'll make you into a great nation, God says. If you're willing to be obedient without all of the information, without knowing the plan, without fully understanding the destination, I will tell you there's going to be great blessing in this. I'll make you into a great nation. I will bless you and I will make you famous and you will be a blessing to others. Who doesn't want that? I mean, who doesn't want to outlive themselves? Who doesn't want to make such a mark that they're not forgotten upon their funeral? Not everybody wants to change the world or to be known by the world. For some of us, it's simply we don't want our family to forget us. We don't want our friends to forget us. We want to know that we had worth and value while we were here. And the only way to really know that is if we, as a memory, have worth and value when we're not here, right? God says, you'll make a difference. You'll be remembered. You will be great. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who treat you with contempt, and all the families on earth, and this is understood now, and I think should have been understood even in that moment of meaning not just people who were related to Abram, not just people who were Jewish, but all the families on earth will be blessed through you. Certainly, we see this as a hint, and we've used that word through this study and will continue to use this study. We've seen this hint as a shadow of things to come, as a foretelling, a foreshadowing of things to come in Jesus, that there is, and this is certainly reading into the text, which we want to be careful with doing, but I think on this point, there is cause for us to understand that this is hinting at the coming Messiah and the coming, as Christians would say, of the Messiah who is represented by and fulfilled in Jesus, born in Bethlehem. So with that bit of information and a whole lot of information not yet revealed, Abram departs. We're not told that Abram questions. We're not told that Abram quibbles. We're not told that Abram does anything other than simply be obedient. Now, could those things happen and we weren't just told? Of course. But it seems as though, and we see this in Abram's character a lot, that Abram tends to just be obedient without question, sometimes to his own fault. When he does question, doesn't usually go well for Abram, but sometimes it does. Either way, it doesn't seem as though he questions here. So he departs as the Lord had instructed. So he follows the directions to go, and Lot, who is his nephew, goes with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. 75 years old. Now, I'm certainly not the first person to make this point, but I think it bears repeating in that you're never too old. Abram's story, for all intents and purposes, does not begin until he's 75 years old. Does it seem as though people perhaps lived a bit longer in those days? Maybe. But not like 200, 300, 400 years at Abram's time. His story doesn't begin until 75 years old. And there is still a whole lot of story and a whole lot of blessing and a whole lot of life that is lived in those years. Now, if you're 75 years old or around that age, I think that's an important reminder that your story may actually just be winding up in the spiritual realm. Think about that for just a moment. It wasn't as though Abram didn't hear from God. In fact, the story starts by saying he heard from God again. This line, right? So it feels as though Abram was a person of faith and probably did very many wonderful spiritual things, but his story is just winding up at the age of 75. And I don't mean winding down, but it's just getting started, winding itself up. Yours may be too. But you don't have to be 75. I think there are moments where those in their mid 40s, young 30s, 20s, and even the teenagers in moments wonder, is the greatest part of my story already been written? Is it only downhill from here? I'm too old. Even my age, I look at things in mid 40s and say, I feel like I'm a little too old to accomplish that thing for God. Those days are behind me when I think about that. I'm not so sure. You're never too old. And believing you are is something that can happen just as easily in your 70s, can happen just as easily in your 20s. And it's not true. And I think this is another point to be made. You're never too wealthy or secure. This, I think, may have been a bigger deal for Abram than his age, was the comfort, the money, the security that he had where he was, upending all of that in order to follow a God that wasn't giving all of the information, to be obedient when you weren't fully sure what the outcome would be, to risk your wealth, your security, your future, all of those things on something that might not prove to be as safe or secure or as financially stable as you were before you were obedient. That, to me, for most of us, is the more difficult thing. I'd love to think which is more difficult for you. Maybe that's not you. Maybe it's the age that would be a more difficult hill to surmount. Maybe it's the wealth, or maybe it's the safety and security, the comfort of where you are. For all of us, those are different, but I think for Abram, it was this one. It was this one right here that was the bigger sacrifice to make. So he takes his wife, Sarai, his nephew Lot, all his wealth, his livestock, all the people he had taken into his household at Haran, and heads for the land of Canaan. And when they arrived in Canaan, Abram traveled through the land as far as Shechem. There he set up camp beside the oak of Moreh, and at that time the area was inhabited by the Canaanites. He is far from home and in a different land with different people, with different customs and different concerns. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "You're here. This is it. I'm going to give this land to your descendants." And so Abram, fascinating response here, built an altar, dedicates it to the Lord who had appeared to him. Abram pauses and worships. It's interesting. It doesn't say I'm going to give it to you. It says I'm going to give it to your descendants. I don't want to read too much into that at this moment, but it's fascinating that Abraham is the one who is obedient, but it feels as though the communication is always, it will be others who will receive the blessing. Now, Abram receives blessings, and certainly you can say that your children in your family receiving the blessing is you receiving the blessing. But I think it is important for us to recognize that there are those moments whenever our obedience doesn't result directly or fully in our receiving the full blessing or the full payoff. But it may well be that it is others around us or after us who are blessed by our obedience. You know what this requires? This requires humility and an understanding that you are not the center of the world, and that sometimes your best and greatest gift isn't to yourself, it's to others. Sometimes the largest measure of your obedience and what you create and what you leave behind is a gift you give to others, but not one that you receive. So as we bring this in for a landing, because, well, I'm already over time now that I look at it, let's end here. One thing that I think is important to this story, and if you're sharing it with kids or family, obedience for Abram comes before blessing. Is it always that way? Well, maybe that's a great question to consider as you talk about this passage. Does obedience always come before blessing? But what if it does? And for Abram, it does, that obedience comes before blessing. Would you still choose to be obedient? You might say yes, but are there moments where you have? Or are there moments where you've chosen not to be obedient to what you thought or knew was being asked of you because you weren't certain of the blessing? Now, if it's difficult to think about this in the spiritual realm, then take it to the physical realm, in the workplace or in the home, in the family. Can you think of instances or moments where you have resisted, been cautious, or refused to be obedient because you weren't certain that the blessing, the payoff, the benefit would come true? Well, that's all the time that we have for until today. We will see you tomorrow. And until that time, happy reading.